Dolphins and the Buffalo Bills. In order to tell this story, we have to go back really before the Bills were even formed. And in the early part of, believe it or not, the 20th century. That's right, the 1940s and 50s, and right before that, right before the 50s, before we went into the second half of the 20th century. And during that time, Buffalo was an incredible place. The first 50, 60 years of the 1900s, Buffalo was in fact one of the most populated cities in the entire country. Had a booming economy. It was a hub for travel, goods that came through all the time, and especially steel manufacturing. And this is before the Bills were even founded. We know about that. A place called Lackawanna Steel was one of the biggest, employers of people in the Buffalo region and in the country, actually. And it was actually purchased then by Bethlehem Steel. Let me tell you how big Bethlehem Steel was back then. During World War II, the Lackawanna plant of Bethlehem Steel became, get this, the world's largest steel-making operation with over 20,000 workers in our little Lackawanna plant. Things started to change in the late 1950s and through the 1960s. What does it all have to do with football? I'll get to that in a minute, but just stay with me here. The company lost the bid to provide the steel for the World Trade Center before it was built. That was a big blow. Then it allowed other companies, and also that, I should say, allowed other companies to prosper. Then some foreign companies came in, new technologies. They started cutting in as well. Now, right around the same time this was happening, when Lackawanna / Bethlehem Steel started to have their profits cut and their production cut, the Buffalo Bills were founded and formed. And they started playing in a new league called the AFL. Remember the Foolish Club? Ralph Wilson, we all know about that now. Over this summer, you should have learned about that, especially the last several months. But no one knew what to expect with this new football league. Then the Miami Dolphins were founded as well. And they came along a little bit after the Bills in the 60s. And then we had the AFL-NFL merger. And both these teams went into the AFC East during that merger. And that was really because of Ralph Wilson fighting to keep the Bills and the Dolphins together because they had already played some. They were tied in together. He wanted that quote-unquote rivalry to stay intact for many years, which obviously he had tremendous foresight in that. They played each other twice a year from there. Now let's go to October 18th, 1970. All right? On October 18th, 1970, that was truly, basically, the first time these two teams played as a merged NFL-AFL game. The Bills lost to the Dolphins that day, 33-14. 33-14 on October 18th, 1970. Then the Dolphins beat the Bills twice that year. And then they beat them twice in 1971. And then they beat them twice in 1972. And twice in 1973. And twice in 1974. And the Dolphins beat the Bills twice in 1975. And the Dolphins beat the Bills twice in 1976. Are you sensing a theme? That's right, they beat them twice again in 1977. And twice in 1978. And again twice, you guessed it, in 1979. 20 straight victories. Any year that started, or I should say that had a 7 in the third digit, any year that had any game that was played in a year that had a 7 in the third digit, the Miami Dolphins beat the Buffalo Bills. From 1970, October 18th, 1970, through the end of the 1979 season, they played twice a year, 10 years, 20 games, and the Miami Dolphins beat the Buffalo Bills every single time. And at that same time, what was going on in Buffalo, I told you about Bethlehem Steel. Well, they really began laying off people. They laid off workers by the thousands. And Western New Yorkers were really hit hard and they were losing their jobs. And this continued into the 1980s. A lot of you listening, you probably had family members that were affected by this. And then when Bethlehem Steel started closing, it kind of really spark-plugged the population decline in Buffalo. The population was drastically declining. Taxes went up for families everywhere because Businesses were leaving, and they were really a lot of the tax base the business was. Families and businesses packed up. They left town. There was nothing here for them. It was getting too expensive to live because they couldn't afford the taxes, and there weren't as many jobs anymore. And the population continued to drastically decline. And in fact, at that time, Buffalo became a symbol of a declining American Rust Belt city. Let's go back to 1972 during this whole time. Bills, Dolphins. What happened in 1972? We know the Dolphins went undefeated that year, right? Yeah, ask any Dolphins fan. They'll still tell you about it. They think it happened yesterday. It didn't. But on October 22nd, 1972, week 6 of the NFL season, the Bills lost 24-23 to Miami. 24-23. They had a late TD. There was no two-point conversion back then. The Bills scored. They were down 2, but they could only go for 1. So they went for 1. They kicked it. And they wound up losing by 1 point. That's right. The only game that year, the closest game that year for the Dolphins to lose when they went undefeated. 1 point was all that separated the Bills from keeping the Miami Dolphins from an undefeated season. And still the only undefeated season in NFL history. What happened in 1977, some of these games during this whole 70s time period? Well, it wasn't about a game this time. You know what happened in 1977? Many of you remember this for sure. It wasn't the Dolphins. It wasn't the economy. It was the weather. One of the worst blizzards in the history of our country hit Buffalo, New York. People died. You know what else happened? TV stations set up in Buffalo couldn't wait to broadcast to the world about all these, the feet of snow in Buffalo and the people dying. And look at this place. Oh my God, who would ever want to live here? Look at this place. They couldn't wait because this was right around when cable started to come about and people had access to a lot more television. And oh my God, you turn on the news every night for a week and you saw these 10-foot high snowdrifts in Buffalo and people dying and they couldn't wait to show everybody. Then the jokes started. Still today. Buffalo. Yeah. We just kept getting beat up in Buffalo. The economy, the population, the jobs, the weather. And those beatings from Miami, by the way, they continued for 2 more years after the blizzard of 77. Buffalonians were mad. Many lost their livelihood. They had a right to be. Many were just tired of it all. Just tired, just fatigued. A lot of them just wanted an outlet. People just want, if you're a sports fan, you know what I say you know what I mean when I say you just want an outlet. You want to cling on to sports when things aren't going your way. You just want something to relieve you. Like, all these horrible things going on in the world, we still got sports at least we can look to. I mean, maybe not now with the NFL and some of their storylines that are going on, but you know what? We look to sports for an outlet. Our sports here, our teams were our outlet, especially the Bills. But every time you turned around and wanted that outlet in the 1970s, the Dolphins were right there to kick that damn door right in your face. 20 straight times. See, people wanted something to be mad about. They wanted an outlet. They couldn't get it because the one thing that kept holding that outlet back, believe it or not, were the Miami Dolphins. So everybody just basically started to take all that rage, all that frustration, the economy and Bethlehem Steel and the loss of the population and people leaving this city and everything bottled up and you just want to scream. And you know who we wanted to take it out on? Those people from South Florida that beat us every single time we had a chance to feel good about ourselves. They wouldn't let us feel good about ourselves. It became psychological. It's about Miami now. And all the jokes, who would rather live up there in the snow? Come down here, look at all the sunshine, our team wins. Who'd want to live there? Look at you on TV. People dying in a blizzard. Come here and enjoy the beach. That's what we had to endure. On top of their team beating us for 20 straight years. Until 1980. The opener of 1980. How ironic. After all those years, 1970 through 79, you get to 1980, the first game of the season. The Bills win. Fans were so excited in Buffalo. Ran out in the field. They rushed the field. They tore down the goalposts. And at that moment in time, a true rivalry was born. Because that's how we showed the world how much we hated the Miami Dolphins. didn't stop there because the Dolphins and Bills went at it a few times in the early 80s and each team won a little bit. But every time they did, that hatred was ratcheted up a little bit, especially because of a guy named Don Shula. See, Don Shula wasn't just, at the time, basically the greatest coach with the most wins and Super Bowls and an undefeated season. He also, just happened to be a guy who was chairman of the competition committee in the National Football League. He was the head of it. And every single time the Bills played the Dolphins, I'm telling you, go ask your mom, go ask your dad, go ask your grandfather, go ask your great uncle. Every single time the Bills played the Dolphins, there were some mysterious calls that went against the Bills, just like it seems today. And I'm not one to blame referees, but I can tell you growing up then, those things happened. It wasn't just the Bills, it was everyone, but man. I remember going to a Pop Warner banquet at the end of my Pop Warner season in Cheektowaga Little League football. We had several Bills speak. Even some of the players spoke about Don Shula and being on the competition committee and how ridiculous it was, some of the things that happened. I remember one time a flag was thrown at a Monday night football game. Shula got in the ref's ear, and they picked up the flag and said, no penalty. Just like they basically did against us in Chicago in the game there on Sunday. In the mid-1980s, Miami still pretty much, they owned the Bills, because the Bills were bad. And then, that happened until 1987. A guy named Marv, and another guy named Jim, and another guy named Bruce, and a guy named Daryl that had these Spider-Man arms, and a guy named Andre. They all came along. Then another guy named Thurman just happened to trot into the backfield a year later. There were some good years against Miami, baby. Bills feasted. In fact, the Bills kept winning throughout the late 80s, early 90s, going to Super Bowls. And they even kept winning, even though there was a guy in the Dolphins named Brian Cox. Oh, the Bills owned Brian. They owned him. For all those years in Miami, they owned him. 1991 to 95, that's all he played. So even though they owned him, he made it personal. He came to Ralph Wilson Stadium, and he flipped you off. He flipped off all Bills fans everywhere. He claims batteries were thrown at him, things like that, whatever. He was flipping people off. Then he went on a national TV show, and he said, if I ever get traded to Buffalo, I'll retire. In fact, he said, if I get traded to Buffalo tomorrow, I'll retire. Brian Cox said that. Well, he didn't last long in Miami. He eventually went to Chicago. He was there by 1996. And then a few years later, Marv was gone, and Jim was gone, and Don Shula was gone, and Dan Marino was gone. And the rivalry's really never been the same since. But it doesn't matter. Not here. Not in Buffalo, because it's not just about the rivalry. It's about the hatred. It's about all that losing we endured in the 70s. It's about winning and tearing down the goalposts in the 80s, and then dealing with Don Shula for years on the competition committee. It's about Brian Cox coming into our house and giving the finger to fans. If you're in your late 30s or older, you get what I'm talking about. I'm 41. You know it. You lived it. If you're younger, you might not. Maybe until tonight. Understand it. That's why we hate the Miami Dolphins. It's your story for tonight.